and ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. This is Irreverent, Faith and Current Affairs.
I'm delighted to be joined today by MP for Devices and author of the new work, Covenant, the New Politics of Home, Neighbourhood and Nation, Danny Kruger. Danny, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's a delight to have you.
Thanks for having me, Jamie.
Oh, very good, very good. Well, listen, Danny, we've just met, and I don't know too much about you in terms of your background. I'm aware of, some of your, the stuff that you're up to nowadays, but I was really interested to read in the introduction about your sort of influences in this book. And to be honest, I quite encouraged and surprised really to see the list of influences that you name. You name people like Yoram Hazony and Patrick Deneen, who's been on this podcast, but also John Milbank as well. Now, listeners to this podcast know that I've written a book which I never ever mentioned, but it was based on my DPhil, and I wrote a couple of chapters on John Milbank, specifically theology and social theory. And I think if I'm not mistaken, you must have read that book as well and been influenced by it. So I found all that very, very impressive, if I may say so. And I found the book to be intellectually erudite and stylistically strong as well. So my first question is, can you tell me a little bit about your sort of intellectual and political development and background in that sense?
Well, thank you. What a lovely question. I'll try and keep it brief. Yes, I mean, I'm very inspired by Milbank, Alistair MacIntyre before him, and this tradition of sort of critics of Thatcherism, really, from the sort of Labour right, it's difficult to give these terms full meaning, but there's a tradition of writers, I think, who are probably in the conservative tradition, but they identify left, and their sort of political affiliations are on the left. John Gray is another one, and since the 80s, they've been writing about how conservatism has an essential intellectual flaw, which is that it relies on values and institutions and virtues which its own policies undermine. Obviously, the free market depends on values of trust and reciprocity and goodwill that market activity harms. I mean, I don't fully accept that critique, but I recognise its force, and I think it's I think it's at least partly true, and it's very, very important insight. So Milbank, he's on the shelf there behind me somewhere. A whole bunch of others, obviously in the more familiar conservative tradition. I studied Burke I did my DPhil on Burke as a politician in the 18th century MP, and his political activity. But obviously read all his his writings, which are of eternal and universal value, and so as most Tories would, I put myself in the Burkean tradition. But what is Burke? How one should apply him today is, I suppose, the question we will struggle with, whether we recognise that's the struggle or not as conservatives. I mean, I just to answer your question slightly more personally. I mean, I guess I grew up. I was a teenager in the 80s and early 90s. I guess I was always a conservative. I was, momentarily inspired by the neoliberal, the libertarian, the Ayn Randian philosophy, which I recognise it's sort of pure beauty and power. But by the time then I studied Burke I studied history in undergrad and then Burke postgrad. So by my mid 20s, I guess I'd realised there's more to life than individual autonomy and the free market, and I became a kind of communitarian at that point, and then a Christian. So in that order. So I was a sort of communitarian before I was a Christian, and I actually think that to a certain extent followed. And I remember meeting the gang who ran the Conservative Christian Fellowship, Tim Montgomery, Peter Franklin, still both very active in conservative thought today. Back when we were, just in the early Blair years, and feeling very inspired by them and what they were trying to do with the Conservative Party. So that in a sense is my natural, that's my identity.
Yes.
identity.
Yes. Well, thank you for that. And I mean, that's fascinating. I'd love to go into that in a bit more detail, but our time is limited today. So I think what we should do is we should go into the themes of the book, and I'm sure some of this will spill out a bit, some of the autobiographical elements. I certainly do have some questions about the role of Christianity and a sort of transcendent understanding of the universe, I suppose. But anyway, let's so I was trying to sort of think of how to summarize the sort of core of your argument. And I think you begin the book by talking about how we're sort of teetering on the edge, potentially, of all sorts of problems, threats from terrorist groups or global financial crashes, military dictatorships, vulnerability of globalized supply chains, energy grids, antibiotics and their potential ineffectiveness, bioweapons, weaponization of viruses, and a general sense that the technology that we're developing, well, we're able to develop it on the one hand, but we don't necessarily have the wisdom to know how to use it or whether we should use it on the other. You end the book by talking about a vision of the nation, specifically the vision of the UK and I suppose more specifically England. And all throughout the book, you have this antithesis between what you call the order and the idea. And it seems to me that the core of your argument is that if we are to meet these challenges and overcome them, then we need to rediscover and re-implement the order, and we need to resist the manifestation of the idea. And this is how we'll recover our sense of nationhood, our sense of community, our sense of ourselves as a family and as what you call a oikos or a parish or a neighborhood or something like that. So that's kind of my understanding of your sort of core argument. I mean, have I got that right? Is that basically what you're saying in this book?
Yes, very good summary, Jamie. Yes. Yeah, I mean, starting with the threats, I think it's an appropriate conservative instinct. I mean, my party is full of talk of opportunity and, modernity and innovation, enterprise, all these brilliant things. And I do actually, I mean, paradoxically, I am quite optimistic personally. I'm sort of inspired by our times, and I can imagine things being so cheerful. But let's start with the reasons to be fearful, and they are enormous. I don't know what your view is, but it doesn't. I mean, every generation might think this historically, but I think we've got good reason to think there's never been such a sort of concatenation of threats and such absolute threats to obviously to life on Earth and to our well-being. And we see all sorts of reasons to feel extremely precarious. And you've listed a bunch of them. So, what's going on? Deep down, I think we are in a philosophical or an ideological confusion, and it's quite a familiar one. In every generation or every sort of era, I think this battle has to be fought, and it is the battle between what I call the idea, which as a Christian you'll recognize as the original mistake, the mistake that you or I, each of us individually, have the creative power and the authority to determine what is good and evil and what is real and not real. We have the ability to create moral and material reality, and I think that's a mistake. And it's not been the theory that has driven our civilization over the centuries. A different theory has driven us, which of course is as much a practice as a theory, which is what I call the order, which is the combination of institutions, habits, expectations, and the obligations we have to the past, that between them create the conditions in which people can be good to one another. And whereas the idea, what I call the idea, which is this idea of the sort of self-created autonomous individual, unrelated, without obligations, and free, essentially free of other people. Whereas that the idea is based on I think a mistaken idea of human reason, and in our era, explicitly, you can see it in Hobbes and Locke in the beginning of the modern liberal political theory. a society built on reason, John Rawls in our time, but it's the same idea going back centuries. Whereas the idea is built on this mistaken vision of reason, that the order is built on love. It's built on a set of obligations that can't really be explained. They just exist, and they're unconditional and permanent, and they and genuinely reciprocal, and they can't really be broken. Or if they are broken, there's a permanent breach and distress as a result. So the foundational idea of the order, what makes the order real, is this notion of the covenant, which of course is a Christian term, really derived from the original themes of the Old Testament around the promises that God made to the people of Israel, but as absolute application beyond that moment. And I think one of the great contributions of Christianity has been to apply the covenant, the notion of the covenant, to social organization in general. And although you can see the application of social organization in the Old Testament too, and Jonathan Sacks has written brilliantly about this in the context of Deuteronomy. But what we've done in the sort of Judeo-Christian tradition, however you want to attribute the origins, is make this particularly religious idea of the covenant just to we've given it secular application. And a covenant is unlike a contract, which is sort of transactional, and you or I could just break it at any time, and there might be a penalty, but basically it's understood, it's time limited, and it's only for the benefit of the two parties, and it's entered into by each party for their own selfish reasons. A covenant is something that has far deeper and broader value, and the covenantal institutions that undergird us all and make our society, and try and bring all of this airy stuff down to earth for you. What my book's really about is the covenant of the three covenants of family, neighborhood, and nation, and at the core of each of these things, family, neighborhood, and nation, is a kind of covenantal relationship. For the family, it's the married relationship. For neighborhood, it's civil society, it's the institutions which make up a place, which include private sector activity, but also local government and so on. And then for the nation, it's the state, which is a combination of power and ceremony, and has sort of emotional as well as a sort of it's something to be loyal to, not just something to fear. Anyway, so I've tried to explain there that the idea is the mistake we're all subject, tempted by, each of us individually, to be self-determined and indifferent to others, and the order is the set of institutions and obligations that make us good people and make us work well as a society.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things I find really interesting about that is that you implied it yourself there. You're almost saying that the sort of Enlightenment political tradition. Well, the way I read what you're saying, and I've seen this also, I think, a bit in Yoram Hazony's work, is that the sort of Enlightenment political tradition, it tries to ground the political order on rationality, as opposed to the previous order, which would have been grounded on the notion of the sacred. And I'm not sure exactly how you'd articulate this, but because of the breakdown of that project, but the project of political rationalism, let's say, we then move into this kind of postmodern sort of neo-Marxist space where we've sort of essentially abandoned the notion that there could be some kind of common good which is agreed upon rationally by people in societies. And so basically now what it is it's up to the individual to be the arbiter of his own good or evil, as it were. And on the other hand, you have this notion, this sort of concomitant notion that the role of the state is not to sort of facilitate virtuous individuals, but the role of the state is to liberate people from structures of oppression and so on and so forth. So, I mean, that's kind of what I took you to be saying. And the interesting thing for me, especially considering you've implied it there, is that you're sort of equating this with the notion of almost original sin, or, you know, that sort of that archetypal choice to, you know, favor myself as the individual, my own sort of creation of what I consider to be good and evil, and so on and so forth. So there's a deep theological component in what you're saying, I suppose. Am I getting that right?
Yes, I mean, I guess there is, and I mean, I mean, I don't make any bones about thinking that the roots of our politics lie in the Christian tradition, and I think, you know, as Tom Holland obviously and many others have brilliantly explained, I mean, it's absolutely mad to think otherwise, and the great, you know, frustratingly pervasive error in our society and our culture is to somehow think that, you know, the progress of society, and particularly the progress of liberty, and of human rights and respect for others and respect the value of each individual, is somehow has been a process of rebellion against Christianity. You know, we fought Christianity to be free. I think the predominant idea. It's just so totally wrong. It is Christianity that's made us free. It's why freedom evolved in the Christian West. It's not in conflict with Christianity, although often there was conflict with the church. But you know, so yes, we've got to, whether you're a liberal, indeed whether you're an atheist or and a militant secularist, or a believer, you've got to acknowledge where it all comes from, and I don't think this is a dead root either. I mean, some people might acknowledge that and say, yes, fine, thank you so much for the inheritance, but we're going to do things our way now.
Yeah.
And we don't need any of that, or we can put it in a museum. And you know, I think that is deeply dangerous, because there's only one alternative to a politics rooted in our Christian heritage, which is, you know, which is the opposite.
Yeah.
Which is what we're getting. So, I mean, I'm not saying, but of course, you know, mentioned secularism. Secularism is a Christian product too, and you know, the importance of the difference, separating church and state, recognizing that all people are equal no matter their beliefs, that there is space for everybody no matter their beliefs in the public square and in political life. That, you know, we, you know, possibly uniquely among the religions of the world, but I don't want to criticize others. You know, we have a tradition of tolerance and of being ecumenical within the movement, within the Christian movement, but also understanding that freedom of conscience is itself a God-given principle. And so, you know, emphasizing that, so I don't want people to think on the theocratic Christianity, but we are fundamentally in that root, and still, I think, our civilization only has any meaning insofar as to recognize that it's framed by Christianity. And in terms of the role of the state, which you mentioned there, I mean, yes, so I explained that, you know, whereas historically, traditionally, and I think still, and I should just quickly mention in parenthesis, you know, I think this is extremely modern. All that I sound and write and am inspired by the past, and want to talk about our traditions and our inheritance. I think there's something uniquely appropriate to the moment we're in, 21st century, with all of these threats and the extraordinary implications of technology. This whole agenda, what I'm describing about the order, is, you know, powerfully relevant to this modern moment. But anyway, just taking a step back, because I'm not ashamed to say how things used to be. We used to think that the job of the state was to create the conditions in which people could be good, so ensure that there was some strength underneath the institutions and associations that enable us to be virtuous and behave well, and to be happy and strong.
Yeah.
So the job of the state was, and still is, and should be, in my view, is to ensure that families and communities and the nation are strong, and then everything becomes easier. And the other job of the state, which is to sort of help people in trouble, becomes much diminished because we reduce demand for that kind of help. But that's the old idea, and what I think should be the new idea, the future idea too. But the one we're battling with, the kind of 20th century to early 21st century idea that we're up against, has a different idea of what the state should be, which is the job of what I call facilitation, mitigation, and sanction. So it's to facilitate individual autonomy, to facilitate the idea to say you can be whatever you want to be, you can have every opportunity that there is going. Our job as the government is to facilitate your freedom, your individual personal path. Which of course is really the job of families and communities to do that, but we decided it's the job of the state. And then so it's facilitation, and then it's mitigation. It's like dealing with the fallout of people making choices that turn out to be bad for them and bad for others. So the business of mitigation, criminal justice, welfare, a lot of our health spending, all of which is basically clearing up and paying for the consequences of lives gone wrong. Yeah. And I spent my career outside politics working in that space. It's a fun, and you will too, as a priest. The job of human beings is to help others, particularly those whose lives have gone wrong, and to do so in a supportive and non-judgmental way. I just think it's very difficult when the state takes on that role. Reasons we could explore. So facilitation and mitigation are the two big jobs of government, and the third one is sanction, because which is when things go wrong, when it doesn't work, when you've got too much welfare, too much crime, suddenly the state starts to doing what the state kind of should do, which is exercise force, but it's using it on its own people. To sanction, which is this terrible word that benefit claims fear, or impose harsh justice on people. I mean, I think there is a massive job for government in terms of the administration of justice and punishment, but that is the thing the government increasingly is having to do. So we have a huge prison population, for example, possibly not big enough given the state of crime. But that traditional role of government as being there to basically impose order and monopolize force, is used, so much and against our own people. And as I said, but possibly not enough given the state of social breakdown, but it's not a good situation we're in when the government is facilitating irresponsibility, mitigating the effects of it, and then sanctioning people when its patience snaps. I just think the government could be doing so much better than those things.
Yeah, so that sort of tees up my next question quite nicely, because I'm very much on the same page as you when you're talking about these things. I'm thinking, of course, this is the way that the government and the state should operate, and so on and so forth. But it's there's a huge gap between what I read in your book and what I see in terms of government policy and the way that the state operates. The size of the state and as you say, its involvement in those kind of areas which really should be the preserve of the family and the neighborhood and so on and so forth. So I guess that's the first part of my question. This is all very well and good in terms of the realm of ideas, but what could actually ground this? And the second part of my question is really, is the thing that grounds this not the notion of the sacred and the supernatural and the transcendent? This is the question I always feel like I'm asking. It seems to me like this isn't really possible without some kind of revival of Christianity in some real and widespread sense, because if you don't have that transcendent vision, you've got nothing to ground the notion of the order on, because you don't ultimately believe, or not in any kind of tangible sense, in some kind of transcendent realm of objective good, of objective virtue, and so on and so forth. I mean, I took what you were saying, the bit about the order and politics, to be that you were essentially saying that the order is a kind of instantiation of transcendent virtue within the political realm, on earth as it is in heaven, as it were. So I guess that's my question is, so we've got this massive problem here, but it seems to me that the massive problem is caused by the decline of actual Christian belief. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, well put. I mean, it's a great challenge to me, and I sort of wrestle with it a lot. I mean, I'm a politician in the secular sphere. I'm not a priest. I don't think it's my job to go around preaching revival, or and certainly not to say that we can only have a happy society if we have revival. But on the other hand, I broadly agree with what you're saying, and I mean, I think the brilliant aspect of the Western tradition has been we have we reified the supernatural. We've made it real in civil society, in a set of institutions, that enable us to worship God through each other, through serving each other, and through our attachment to institutions which don't have to be Christian in their basis, as I say, of government, institutions of leisure and care and education and so on. And I think, I'm trying to call for a revival of the value we place on these institutions locally, and I think we can do that without having an explicitly Christian mission. And you said, first part of your question, what do we do? Well, I think there is a whole bunch of policies which I think would command widespread support from people, frankly, from all political traditions as well as all religious ones, around the importance of local attachment, the strength and sort of wealth of civil society that we need, that has been lost over the decades, including, sad to say, under the current government since 2010. Even though there was a moment in 2010 with a big society when I thought we were going to be where we were, talking the right talk. So, what to do? Well, there's a whole bunch of stuff around, policy that we could explore, and I do a bit in the book. But your broader question about, is any of it meaningful without revival? And in a sense, it's the question that I wrestled with when I ran a charity with my wife that we still run it. I'm chair it now. I'm working with ex-prisoners, and used to get challenged by Christian friends saying, what's the point of helping, trying to provide help, just practical help? These guys need to know Jesus. And I always felt, well, that isn't sufficient. Yes, everybody does, but actually we can still do a lot, just providing practical help. So the charity isn't a Christian charity. There's rehabilitation, resettlement, and support that offenders and ex-offenders. I think we can do a lot in this world and in this life, and I don't think we need to make revival the sort of impediment to doing good work. And I don't think that the order that I describe has to wait for the Christian revival to break out. I think we can do a whole bunch of good stuff now. But as I said at the beginning, I think we should recognise that the root of all of what we're talking about is a set of ideas that have, one dominant root or origin. I mean, there are others too, in sort of Greece and so on. But fundamentally, our civilization is built on these ideas, and it's not a dead root. It's still living.
Yeah, well, this is the place where I really was reminded of Milbank and specifically the notion, what he talks about in theology and social theory, which had a big impact on me the first time I sort of came across this idea of sort of our metaphysical understanding kind of informing our political and social outlook. And I don't think you use this phrase in your book, but Milbank talks about the sort of postmodern nihilism being undergirded by what he calls an ontology of violence, so a sort of a belief that deep down at the kind of bottom of everything is, there's just a play of kind of chaotic forces as is articulated by postmodernists like, people like Deleuze and Derrida and people like that. Like essentially reality is a play of violence. And so if you actually believe that, it's not a surprise that the sort of social and political outworking of that will be fundamentally nihilistic. And so to me, like the sort of the inverse of that is that, well, if that's the case for an ontology of violence, for an ontology of peace, you need at least some kind of transcendental basis undergirding your politics. So I'm not saying that I think it necessarily needs to be explicitly Christian. I think in our context, it's hard to conceive of how it could be not informed by Christianity. But there does seem to me to be a really primal and significant connection between that sort of metaphysical underpinning, like what you believe reality really is at base, and then how things are outworked in the social and political. Does that make sense?
It does. That's well put, and I agree with that. And I think the fact is that we are made for worship. We're made to acknowledge a transcendental and to orient our lives towards it. And people who don't acknowledge that in fact, they're more susceptible to it.
Yeah,
because they don't realise that they're being pushed in that direction. They'll find something to worship and not even realize they're doing it. And of course, my I argue that, well, I make the point in the book that, early man, pre-Christian pagan man was really about the worship of nature. Then, wood and stone and the stars and the rivers and so on. And then we started worshipping God, and now we're worshipping ourselves. And so there is a transcendental at the heart of all. And I think that increasingly we're recognizing that. I mean, the loss of God has not made us less religious. It's just created a whole bunch of wacky new religions, of which, environmentalism is a key one, and actually reflects a lot of our old pagan idea of the worship of nature. So I think people are absolutely, fundamentally disposed to a spiritual politics. And there is a reaction to the sort of rationalist, overly human, stress on sort of practical efficiency, which has dominated our political discourse in my lifetime. And I think we are seeing a growth of a new and more exciting politics. The problem is it's potentially extremely dangerous because people are attaching to fundamentalisms. Of left and right, of religious, as I say, sort of pagan ideas. So I'm hoping that people will recognise that, given we've got to worship something, and we've got to build our politics on some kind of transcendental understanding, the best and safest and richest one is the traditional one, which, as I said a minute ago, is, I think, peculiarly appropriate, as of course it would be. But it is remarkably appropriate to the challenges of the modern time, and dealing with technology, dealing with globalization, and legal movements and civilizational clashes that we're seeing. So that's why I'm hopeful.
Yeah. Well, and that seems like a good place to talk, to move into a discussion of new political manifestations. I mean, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was the National Conservatism movement and the National Conservatism conference that you spoke at. I think it was earlier this year, wasn't it? In that conference, in your speech, you said something like that. You said, I forget the exact quote, but it was something like, it was pretty close to, the only stable basis for a society is the family, married parents and children, or something like that. Now, this was a remark that created some controversy. We spoke about this on the podcast. It was said by one of your colleagues that this was a completely fringe view in the Conservative Party, that this was extremely offensive, that it was very wrong, and that if you continue talking like this, you'll put the Conservatives out of power for a generation. So I suppose I just wanted to ask you about that movement, the sort of NatCon movement, how you see that, whether you see hope in that, and also specifically that kind of pushback that you got after that conference, and indeed when you say these kind of things in general.
Yeah, I mean, if it's true that this pretty uncontroversial idea that society is built on families and families are built on couples, and married couples most of all, then if that's fringe, we are in a world of trouble, aren't we? But in a sense we are, and it is. Yes, so I mean, I periodically say things which strike me as, I mean, they might be a bit pithy. That's the problem. Say these sorts of things in a sort of elaborate way and with all the usual caveats and so on, and nobody notices. But I say things occasionally that ignite controversy because they're a soundbite that can be clipped, and then other people pile in saying how outrageous. I mean, the Conservative Party is obviously, deeply torn on these questions, as is the Labour Party, and as our whole culture is. No surprise there. I regret that my party is not more vocally representative of what I think of its own philosophy. Its supporters, I mean, our voters, our members, are very much more socially conservative, and I just think socially real. I mean, realism. It's what we are, than the political class. But a lot of my colleagues think that the political class is their audience. rather than the public. And so, yeah, I mean, that conference, I mean, I Hazony, who you mentioned, Israeli American professor, written wonderfully about conservatism and about and this national conservative idea, which I'm sure you've explored it.
Yeah.
Previously. But and his organization, which is called the Edmund Burke Foundation, so obviously I'm gonna like it, runs these conferences around the world, and they did one in London. I spoke at it, a bunch of other colleagues did from Parliament, and it was just really, really good. It was full of young people, full of ideas, a big tension in it. I mean, people accuse it of incoherence, which I think is valid. I mean but it's the incoherence that is the heart of conservatism that we discussed at the very beginning, which is between the kind of liberal free market agenda and its conservative, socially conservative, communitarian family and neighbourhood agenda. And the tension between those things is the tension within each of us, between our desire to be free and our desire to belong. And I think it's okay to have that tension expressed. And it was discussed at the conference. There was lots of really good speeches packed out, just showed the vitality intellectually and sort of socially of the conservative movement. So I think it was great. And yes, it annoyed all the right people. I mean, no doubt they could have been a bit better at their tweeting. I thought the organisers didn't quite understand the subtleties of British political Twitter.
Yeah.
And we, ended up aggravating people unnecessarily, I think, with those sort of standalone clips. But, politics is a bit rough, and it is slightly conducted in headlines and sound bites. So there we are. And I think we've got a set of principles on the map. And there's a confidence on the right in conservatism at the moment. So unrelated to the national conservative agenda and conference and so on, Miriam Cates, my MP friend, and I set up a little outfit which is called the New Social Covenant Unit a couple of years ago, focused on family policy and neighbourhood stuff, civil society. But we're now working with a wider bunch of MPs, and we call ourselves the New Conservatives. We're all elected since 2016, since the referendum on Brexit. We stand for this realignment in our politics, this idea that we can be a national party like we were after the 2019 election.
Yeah,
representing seats from all over the country with these, authentic, I think, quite traditional conservative ideas, but also, not constrained by politics of the past, and able to articulate, I think, a really exciting vision for the future. So the New Conservatives, we are pushing a whole bunch of these ideas, and trying to do so in a way that doesn't cause trouble for the leadership, because we're getting close to an election now. We need to be constructive and supportive as we are of Rishi. Nor do we think we need to just shut up now and stop thinking and speaking. I think we have an obligation as MPs to make our ideas known. As long as they're not in direct conflict with our colleagues, with the party. And so that's what we're up to. And I think there's a lot of energy in the space now. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, well, I've got one more sort of general question, which sort of falls out of your book. This podcast was we started this podcast about 3 years ago. It was in the middle of the sort of lockdown periods and everything like that. One of the reasons we did it is because Tom and I at first, and then Daniel joined us afterwards. We were concerned that we weren't really hearing from the church what we felt the church should have been doing or saying, which providing spiritual leadership for people. And we were, I think it's fair to say, extremely skeptical about what was going on in terms of lockdowns, in terms of the so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions and so on and so forth. Therefore, I was intrigued to read at the beginning of your book that you, as a matter of historical record, that you voted in favour of at least some of the lockdown measures, but you actually used a strong word. You said something like that you were ashamed to have done so, or something like that. I apologise if that's not precisely the right word, but it was something like that. So I'm interested to ask you about that. And then I hope you don't mind me asking about this as well, but I noticed that you were, I think it was Andrew Bridgen's adjournment debate was yesterday. I think I noticed that you were present at that. So I wanted to just ask you, just if you could just let us just elaborate a bit more for our audience in terms of that comment that you make in your book about that sense of shame you talk about, and then just anything you could say about the Andrew Bridgen. Andrew's actually been on this podcast several months ago now. Obviously that's a controversial issue, but yeah. I'd be really interested in that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah. So I was a late convert to kind of COVID or lockdown skepticism. I supported it all obediently to begin with, and in fact I was partly very inspired by the behaviour of the country during 2020 in the lockdowns. While part of the country was going mad and running about George Floyd, and there was all sorts of crazy kind of culture stuff going on. Most people getting on with being good neighbours, good citizens, doing what they're asked by the government, helping each other out locally. There's all sorts of innovation in local public services and businesses. So I thought there's something great going on here, and I wrote a report for the government about how to learn the positive lessons of lockdown for creating stronger communities. So all that was really encouraging, and I thought, oh, it'll pass, and I trust the government. And actually, but 2 years after 2 years of it, I realised that there was much more malign. I don't blame any individual. I'm not one of those who thinks that there's some sort of evil conspiracy to do harm. I think a lot of people, good people, trying to do their best, and Matt Hancock, and we were all as politicians trying to muddle our way through. So I think individuals ultimately do need to take responsibility, decision makers do, but I'm not interested in blame. I think the system as a whole failed us. We as citizens sort of went along too meekly with a bunch of stuff, but crucially, and where I feel the shame you mentioned is as an MP, Parliament just went on leave. I mean, we literally just abandoned our job through those 2 years, I think. Again, you can understand why, and we can make explanations and so on. I don't blame individuals particularly, but I am to blame as an MP for having supported all sorts of things, allowing them to use the Public Health Act, which basically gave carte blanche to government to do what it liked, without even a debate. And anyway, there's all sorts of, I think, things that were done wrong, and that we recognise. Some bright people recognised it at the time, but it's obvious with hindsight that I think our response was wrong in many, many ways, and the British state wasn't up to the job that it should have been, and Parliament let us down. So that's, I'm quite, I apologise particularly for voting for the sacking of care workers who didn't take the vaccine. I deeply regret that vote, and I've said so publicly. And I've been working with this outfit, Us for Them, which is a campaign group that campaigned against lockdowns on behalf of children. They've been writing a report about the whole episode, and I've just contributed afterward to that, which I hope will try to convey my account of it all. I mention it in the book because I think you've got to worry about the next one, whether it's a pandemic or some sort of other disaster. One of these threats that will assail us. The obvious thing to do would be for the states to reach for maximum power, for the media to row in behind them saying, yes, please tyrannize over us, for the public to say we're scared, please take away our freedom. And for all sorts of, sinister forces, which I don't, as I said, don't think there are, we could spiritualize this, but I don't think there's a great global conspiracy. I just think that there are all organizations try and aggrandize and take power. And if we say to the state or to the kind of global state, the World Health Organization or others, please take charge because we're terrified. If we undermine national sovereignty, if we undermine parliamentary accountability, if we undermine the responsibilities of local neighbourhoods to each other, the obligations of families, and fundamentally, if we remove human freedom, individual freedom, things will go very wrong for us. So we need to be very conscious of these dangers, and particularly when we've empowered the state and the private sector with technology, which has incredible, immense potential to do harm as well as to do good. I think we are in some danger at the moment, and so we need to get all this right and understand what happened during COVID.
Yeah. And any comment on Andrew Bridgen and his activity?
Well, I think Andrew has been brave. I'm not a scientist. I don't really feel equipped to comment on all of his theories about the vaccines. I do think there should be a proper sort of review into the excess deaths phenomenon, which is very serious. I mean, we have a real genuine problem, and a lot of people ascribe it to the vaccine program, and therefore I think sufficient people think that government should be undertaking a proper review, even if only to disprove that anxiety that people have that the vaccines are causing these deaths. And I think, I think Andrew has been brave. I don't think he's always necessarily championing the cause in the most constructive way, but I'm not who am I to criticize him. I think in a sense he's doing the job of an MP, which is speaking up, and good for him. He's become an independent MP or joined a new party now. I think it was wrong that he lost the whip for that remark he made, but he is very independent minded, so I think he might be happier where he is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you, Danny. I know your time is up, so I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and giving such clear and interesting answers to my questions. The book Covenant: The New Politics of Home, Neighbourhood and Nation is available now, isn't it? Widely online. I think is it just in hardback at the moment?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you, Danny. Really appreciate it.